So imagine raising an organism from birth. You watch it fight off this vampire-like infestation completely on its own.
Right.
It's utilizing these complex internal defenses that you can't even see. And it survives the gauntlet. It thrives against all odds, and it fulfills its ultimate biological destiny by successfully reproducing.
Uh-huh.
But then, after all of that triumph, you essentially just toss it in the trash simply because its leaves weren't pretty enough.
I mean, it sounds incredibly harsh when you frame it exactly like that.
Yeah.
We tend to romanticize cultivation, right?
Oh, absolutely.
We just assume it's this nurturing, harmonious partnership between human and nature.
Yeah.
But in reality, a garden is a laboratory, a battlefield, and a beauty pageant, all rolled into one.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
And the criteria for success are just constantly shifting, depending on what the human observer decides is valuable on, any given day.
Which is the exact tension we are exploring in today's deep dive. We are looking at a really fascinating source document from a very dedicated cultivator.
Yeah, this is a good one.
It's a journal entry published on July 9th, 2026, by a writer who goes by the name Ang. And the title of this post alone tells you everything you need to know about the level of expertise we are dealing with here. It's called Notes on Gardening, Part 950.
Right. Part 950.
Yeah.
That implies a staggering amount of trial, error, and just meticulous observation.
Yeah, no kidding.
When someone reaches that volume of documentation, they aren't just logging whether a plant lived or died. They are conducting long-term data analysis on the microecosystem of their own backyard.
They're a scientist, basically.
Exactly. They're watching how variables interact over a long period of time.
And today's variable is the sesame plant, biologically known as sesamum-indicum. So the mission for our deep dive today is to follow Ang's journey of growing sesame from scratch.
Yes.
And in doing so, we want to extract some surprising lessons about human intervention, invisible ecosystem dynamics, and the often contradictory nature of what we actually consider a successful experiment.
Right.
Okay, let's unpack this. Ang notes early in the journal that sesame seeds are just incredibly easy to get your hands on, which is what sparked the whole endeavor.
What's fascinating here is the psychological shift. We're required to look at a standard kitchen staple and see dormant biology.
Yeah, totally.
We are entirely desensitized to sesame seeds, right? They're baked into hamburger buns. They're scattered on sushi, blended into tahini.
They're everywhere.
Because they're processed as a commodity, they become invisible to us as actual living seeds. But Ang looks at this completely mundane pantry item and decides to unlock its genetic potential.
It taps into that very primal curiosity. Like we all did that elementary school science fair project, right?
Yeah, the bean in the cup.
Exactly. Where you take a dried lima bean, wrap it in a damp paper towel, and tape it to a sunny window.
Right.
You aren't doing it for agricultural yield. You're doing it to just ask the universe, is this thing still alive?
And that curiosity is rewarded incredibly quickly with a plant like sesamum-indicum because of its biological programming. The sesame is an annual.
Okay, so what does that mean practically for the gardener?
Well, for an experienced gardener, planting an annual provides a very specific type of satisfaction. You are dealing with an organism operating on a relentless, non-negotiable ticking clock.
Right, because unlike, say, an oak tree or a perennial shrub that can afford to have a bad season, lose its foliage, and just try again next year.
Yeah. An annual doesn't have that luxury. It has one single growing season to get the job done.
So it's basically sprinting from day one.
It is a frantic, energy-intensive dash toward reproduction.
Yeah.
From the moment that seed germinates, the plant is routing every available resource toward one singular goal.
Making more seeds?
Exactly. Producing the next generation of seeds before the frost comes or the life cycle ends. For someone documenting their garden like Ang does, an annual offers a perfectly closed loop.
You don't have to wait a decade to see the results.
Right. Within a matter of months, you witness the entire dramatic arc of existence, from the breaking of dormancy to the vegetative growth, the flowering, the setting of the seed, and the ultimate conclusion of the parent plant.
And Ang notes that this part of the experiment was an absolute success. The seeds germinated, the plants matured, and they successfully closed that loop.
But the journey from point A to point B was not exactly a peaceful one.
No, it was not. Ang reveals a massive vulnerability in the sesame plant's profile because despite being relatively easy to sprout, they are highly susceptible to pests, specifically the mealybug.
Oh, the mealybug. Yeah, that is a formidable adversary in any garden.
So for someone who isn't familiar, what exactly are we looking at?
If you have ever noticed what looks like tiny, fuzzy specks of white cotton congregating on the stems or the undersides of leaves, you are looking at a mealybug infestation. They are phloem feeders.
Meaning they are essentially draining the plant's vascular system.
Right, precisely that.
Oh.
The phloem is the tissue responsible for transporting the sugars and nutrients the plant produces during photosynthesis.
So it's like the plant's bloodstream.
Exactly. The mealybug inserts a specialized appendage, called a stylet, directly into that tissue and siphons off the plant's food supply.
Yikes.
Yeah, and if the population grows large enough, they can completely stunt the plant's growth, cause the leaves to yellow and drop, and eventually kill the host outright.
Which brings us to a very specific, incredibly dire warning in Ang's journal. They state that if you are growing other plants that are prone to mealybugs, and they single out a plant called portulaca, then you shouldn't even bother planting sesame.
Right.
This jumped out at me. Like, why does the presence of a completely different plant act as a death sentence for the sesame? It sounds like we are talking about some kind of Trojan horse scenario here.
If we connect this to the bigger picture,
Mm.
this observation perfectly illustrates the concept of a pest reservoir, which is a fundamental principle of ecosystem dynamics.
Okay, a pest reservoir.
Yeah. We often make the mistake of viewing a garden as a collection of isolated individual objects. We see the potted portulaca on the patio, and we see the row of sesame plants in the raised bed, and we categorize them as totally separate entities.
But the insects obviously don't care about our visual boundaries or our landscaping borders.
Not at all. To a mealybug, your entire property is a single contiguous landscape of resources. The portulaca, which is a low-growing succulent with fleshy leaves and lots of tight little crevices, provides an ideal microclimate for mealybugs to shelter and reproduce.
So they just hide out there.
Right. They build their numbers there, often without causing immediate catastrophic damage to the hardy portulaca. It acts as a safe harbor.
Like a smuggler's cove for garden pests. They just hang out, multiply, and build their army entirely under the radar.
And once that population reaches a critical mass, or once the resources on the portulaca become scarce, they expand their territory.
I see.
If you then introduce a highly susceptible, highly attractive, novel resource into that shared environment, like a tender young sesame plant, the pests just spill over.
It's like putting out a buffet next to their house.
Exactly. The localized population on the portulaca turns the vulnerable new arrival into an absolute magnet. The sesame doesn't fail because it is inherently weak. It fails because the local ecosystem is already saturated with its natural enemy.
So the warning in Part 950 isn't really about the sesame plant at all. It is about understanding the invisible web of relationships already operating in your yard before you introduce a new variable.
Ang is evaluating the environment, not just the individual plant.
But here's where it gets really interesting. Ang knows the mealybugs are there. Ang observes them attacking the sesame plants, but Ang also documents the exact, highly effective organic cure for the problem, which is a homemade mixture of common detergent and vegetable oils.
Right.
Yet Ang explicitly writes, "I've decided to let nature take its course." I mean, I have to push back on this approach.
It is surprising.
Yeah. If you spend weeks nurturing a plant and you hold the cure in your hands, why on earth would you just stand by and watch it get drained dry? Isn't the whole point of cultivation to intervene and tip the scales in your favor, like helicopter parenting versus free-range parenting?
This raises an important question about the underlying philosophy of the cultivator. When you apply that mixture, you are certainly saving the plant, but you are also permanently altering the data of the experiment.
Huh.
You are shifting the variable from the plant's inherent resilience to your own maintenance skills.
I understand the desire for pure data, but how does the detergent and oil mixture actually work? Why is it so effective that Ang has to actively resist using it?
Well, the mechanism is a brilliant example of physical rather than chemical pest control.
Physical control.
Yeah. Mealybugs, like many insects, breathe through tiny openings on their bodies called spiracles. When you spray them with vegetable oil, the oil coats their exoskeleton and physically blocks those spiracles, smothering them.
Wow. Okay. That's pretty brutal.
But there is a catch. Plant leaves are covered in a waxy cuticle, making them naturally hydrophobic. If you just spray oil and water onto a leaf, it will bead up and roll off, leaving patches of the leaf and the bugs completely untouched.
Which is where the detergent comes in.
Exactly. The detergent acts as a surfactant. It breaks the surface tension of the liquid, allowing the water and oil to spread out into a uniform lethal film over the complex topography of the plant's leaves and the insect's bodies.
Okay.
It is incredibly effective entirely non-toxic to the wider environment, and utilizes items already sitting in your kitchen pantry.
Okay, so it's completely safe, it's dirt cheap, and it works instantly. That makes Aang's decision to withhold it seem bordering on masochistic.
I know, I know.
We aren't talking about avoiding toxic industrial chemicals here. We are talking about skipping a little soap and oil. By doing nothing, aren't they just guaranteeing a failed harvest? How is a plant supposed to fight off a physical insect invasion without human help? Plants don't have claws or swatting tails.
We assume plants are passive victims because they can't run away, but their internal defense mechanisms are staggeringly complex.
Oh, really?
Yeah. When a plant is subjected to herbivore damage, like a mealybug piercing its phloem, it doesn't just sit there. It initiates a localized and systemic immune response.
Wait, a plant has an immune system. How does it actually fight back?
Through chemical warfare, essentially. The
Oh,
plant cells can detect the specific proteins in the insect's saliva.
that is wild.
Once detected, the plant triggers a cascade of responses, often referred to as systemic acquired resistance, or SAR. The plant might rapidly thicken its cell walls at the site of the attack to make feeding physically harder.
Like putting up a barricade.
Right. And more impressively, it begins synthesizing secondary metabolites. These are complex chemical compounds that make its sap taste bitter, disrupt the insect's digestion, or even act as a mild toxin.
So it's actively changing its own nutritional profile in real time to make itself a terrible meal.
And it can go even further. Some plants under severe localized attack will strategically cut off the nutrient supply to the most heavily infested leaves.
Wow.
This causes those leaves to die and drop off, thereby shedding a massive portion of the pest population to save the main stem. It is ruthless biological triage.
Okay, that completely recontextualizes Aang's restraint. By withholding the soap and oil, Aang wasn't abandoning the plant at all. They were giving the plant the space to activate its own internal armory.
Precise thought.
They wanted to see if the sesame had the genetic chops to deploy those secondary metabolites and survive the siege on its own merits.
And the journal entry provides the thrilling conclusion to that specific test. Aang notes that despite the infestation, and despite the absolute lack of any human intervention, the sesame plant survived.
Incredible.
They weathered the storm, pushed through their vegetative state, flowered, and successfully produced their seed pods. The plant's natural evolutionary toolkit was entirely sufficient to overcome the environmental pressure of the mealybugs.
It is the ultimate underdog narrative. The plant gets dropped into a hostile neighborhood next to a smuggler's cove of vampires, gets attacked, alters its own chemistry to fight them off, and completely finishes its life cycle.
Yeah, it's quite the saga.
You would expect Part 9 Fifter to end with Aang declaring the sesame plant a permanent, celebrated staple of the garden forever.
One would certainly assume a highly favorable verdict after that display of biological grit.
So what does this all mean? Because we get to the final paragraph of the post, and Aang asks the pivotal question, would I grow sesame again? And the answer is just a flat, unapologetic, not really.
It is a phenomenal twist ending that speaks volumes about the human element in cultivation.
I found it almost jarring. The plant passed every single biological stress test. It gave Aang the seeds it was supposed to give. But Aang writes that the decision to abandon sesame has nothing to do with the mealybugs.
Right.
It is purely aesthetic. Aang explicitly states it is simply because the overall foliage and flowers didn't appeal to me much. After all that warfare, the plant gets evicted because its leaves were a little boring.
This is the dual criteria of the garden layout coming into sharp focus. A backyard garden is a unique space where rigorous biology collides directly with subjective art.
Totally.
On one level, gardening is a structural science. You're managing soil pH, analyzing pest reservoirs, calculating sunlight hours. The sesame plant was a massive success on that biological level. But on the secondary level, gardening is the curation of a visual aesthetic.
And in the backyard, aesthetic pleasure wields the ultimate veto power.
Yes, it does.
It doesn't matter how robust your internal immune system is if the human in charge doesn't like looking at your flowers.
Exactly, because space is finite. Every square foot dedicated to a visually unappealing plant is a square foot denied to something that offers both biological utility and visual beauty.
Right, there's an opportunity cost.
But, Aang doesn't completely discard the value of the sesame. The journal notes that while they won't grow it as a primary crop, they can still leverage the sesame plant for future experiments. They compare it to how they use a plant called celosia.
I'm really glad you brought that up because the mention of celosia felt like a rapid pivot at the very end of the entry. How does comparing it to celosia redeem the sesame plant?
Well, celosia is often utilized by advanced gardeners, not just for its striking flame-like flowers, but for its utilitarian functions within the garden ecosystem.
What kind of functions?
Certain varieties can act as a trap crop, meaning they are deliberately planted to draw pests away from more valuable vegetables, or they serve as structural beacons for specific, highly desirable pollinators.
Oh, I see.
What Ang is implying is that even though the sesame failed the primary beauty contest, its raw biological data is still valuable. It might not earn a spot in the center of a decorative planter, but it could be deployed strategically in the margins of the garden.
Like to test how it influences soil quality.
Exactly. Or to see if its specific pest vulnerabilities can be weaponized as an early warning system for other crops.
So the sesame plant is demoted from the main stage, but it still has a job in the laboratory. It goes from being the star of the experiment to a supporting variable in someone else's test.
Right.
And Ang immediately wraps up the journal by looking forward, wondering what other herbs they should explore in future posts. The trial is over, the verdict is rendered, and the focus shifts right to the next seed packet.
Which is the true hallmark of someone on their 950th journal entry. The garden is never finished. Every conclusion is just the baseline data for the next hypothesis.
Let's recap this incredibly layered journey we've taken through Ang's notes today. We started with the humble, invisible sesame seed, unlocking its rapid, high-stakes annual life cycle.
Yes.
We mapped out the hidden dangers of the garden ecosystem, learning how an innocuous portulaca plant can serve as a biological smuggler's cove, harboring mealybugs until they overrun the yard.
And we explored the complex internal defenses of the plant itself and the profound restraint required by the gardener to withhold a simple soap and oil cure,
Right.
allowing the plant to deploy its own systemic resistance and fight its battles completely independently.
And finally, we confronted that brutal, unpredictable aesthetic verdict. A plant that demonstrated heroic biological resilience and successfully produced a harvest, only to be rejected from future gardens simply because it lacked visual appeal. It is a brilliant case study in the tension between pure utility and human desire.
It really is.
Which brings us to you, listening right now. Think about the projects, the systems, or even the habits in your own life. Whether it's a tool you use at work, a hobby you've cultivated, or a process you've built from scratch.
Yeah.
How often do you evaluate the success of something based purely on its utility, like did it survive, did it function, did it get the job done, versus its aesthetics, did it look elegant while doing it? How many perfectly functional, highly resilient systems have you abandoned just because they didn't appeal to your eye or feel slip enough?
And as you examine that balance between the functional and the beautiful in your own world, consider this final thought from the garden. If a living organism fulfills its entire biological destiny, if it wakes from dormancy, fights off a relentless, sap-draining invasion entirely through its own internal chemistry, and successfully produces the next generation.
Yeah.
But it gets abandoned simply because its flowers fail to impress the human eye. Did the plant fail the gardener, or did the gardener fail to appreciate the plant?